Mr. Mulder, good evening. Thank you very much for your time. Let's start with the unbundling. The minister says government has set a deadline of 2022 for the complete breakup of Eskom's generation, transmission and distribution operations. Your thoughts?
Yes, Vuyo, that's one of the things that we're actually quite glad to read in this roadmap. Thus far, the unbundling has been a process that has been sort of kept in the dark for trade unions, but we've finally got a bit more clarity. What is interesting to us is that transmission is the only one that is definitely earmarked to stay 100% owned, with opening up the possibility of competition at generation and at distribution level. Now, this is good news for South Africa as well as for our members, for the simple reason having more companies that supply power means you're not beholden to one single behemoth who then, when it fails spectacularly. There's much more agility and redundancy in the system, and for our members that means that you can actually now have different employers competing for your skills, and you should be able to move between these. As we've always stated, the best job security for any of our members is a growing economy, and at the moment Eskom is one of the main factors that's completely hindering South Africa's economy from growing to its full potential. That is why this document, we've gone through the initial takes, it's actually very positive. It's a lot of radical reforms that we're curious to see if it's going to make it unscathed through the rest of the policy process. But if the government can actually implement this, and that's the part where our skepticism lies, then we're well on our way to turning Eskom hopefully around, and then to having the South African economy be unleashed from the shackles of load shedding.
Well, what is a bit of an intrigue to some people is how Eskom will have competition from within itself, so to speak.
Yes, so at the moment the document stipulates that it's going to create an Eskom generating entity, but if you look at the power map, it says that there should be almost, I think it's 2,600 megawatts of solar and wind power being added every year until 2030. Now, although Eskom now has the ability or wants the ability to trade into renewables, we're of the opinion that this is way too much for Eskom alone to sort of manage, and that means that government will be forced to go into public-private partnerships to facilitate generation. Now, this is something that we welcome, where we've steadfastly held the position that Eskom should at least have some private sector participation to ensure transparency and efficiency, which is what we see when you apply market principles.
Which was my next.
That does worry us, however.
Which was my next question, because I mean, all three arms will remain functional subsidiaries of the Eskom holding company.
Yes, that's the risks that we've now. If we go the one that's explicitly stated that will remain 100% government owned is the transmission entity, which we've in repeated engagements with the department, they've stated that's the way to go. But there is a space there for creating competition among, especially at the distribution end, with municipalities having to then compete, and then at the generation end with each power generating company, it actually states that we'll be able to keep dividends and pay dividends. Now, you can assume that government would maybe want to own them, but when you're talking about dividends and paying profits, it seems that this is opening the path to a much more private sector participation in generation, and that is something that we think is desperately needed. Just competition in the generation space to enable the market to finally start providing the service, rather than being wholly dependent on, as the document rightly states, an outdated structure, this vertical monopoly that is not able to match the needs of the modern South African economy.
Because Minister Gordhan, of course, left it to his finance counterpart, Tito Mboweni, to deal with the issue of Eskom's 450 billion rand debt burden. What do you expect the finance minister to say tomorrow when he tables his medium-term budget policy statement? We expect a significant bailout to Eskom. Now, this is something that's not unexpected. This has been coming a long way, and that is maybe the one, or two of the weaknesses in this document that we generally received as quite positive. But the main problem facing Eskom is the massive debt situation. It's now 450 billion. That's almost a third of South Africa's budget. So it's rightly so. It's the number one risk towards our economy. And although it's almost 150 billion rand in bailouts that are foreseen by the document, it still does not address the remaining 300 billion rand, which then should be addressed through operating costs and by cutting costs. But it would be it's quite ambitious so that you're going to be able to cut costs enough. Just for this year, Eskom's debt service cost was 70 billion and its operating profit 30 billion. So that's a massive shortfall that needs to be made up. We expect a bailout to be announced tomorrow, with then 3 more bailouts in the coming years. The one thing that is something that I wouldn't say warms the heart, but that is optimistic, is for the first time these bailouts have very stringent conditions. With the one that's necessary is this bailout can only be used to settle debt or interest. No more paying bonuses for Eskom execs out of a bailout received from taxpayer money. Obviously, we're not happy with Eskom needing any bailout at all, but through mismanagement and state capture, we've come to this situation. And that's the second massive risk that Eskom is not properly addressing, or it's a bit vague, is the municipal debt situation. It's now 36 billion rand of municipal debt, with Soweto being 18 billion rand of that. And it's a completely unsustainable situation where people are receiving a service but not paying for it. And if you were to go to a supermarket and just refuse to pay for goods, that supermarket would close down. And this is what's facing Eskom now. The document does state that government will be using all the powers that it has to address it, but it's still a bit vague as to how exactly are you going to change this culture of non-payment into one of payment and get municipalities to finally just pay what they should towards Eskom. These are 2 weaknesses that we've identified. The third one is, of course, we're skeptical about government's actual capability to implement this plan. It's quite ambitious. What we've got now is they've put several mile markers there. There are several targets that need to be met at quite ambitious timelines, and we can now hold government to account regarding this plan. It's a new place where you've got a government that actually commits to targets and timelines that the public can hold to account. The question would always then be what happens when they miss them, because with Medupi and Kusile we've seen that missing targets is something that Eskom and our government tends to do.
Now, speaking of state capture, you then agree with him when he made an appeal for patience and understanding, saying the impact and effect of state capture cannot be underestimated. The impact was huge, it was systemic, he said, and it was more than stealing a few billion rands.
Yes and no. So state capture definitely contributed to the current state that Eskom is in, and it contributed a lot. You would see that it was the main trough that the tax plunderers sort of fed out of. But what this document also states repeatedly is that these are reforms that were advocated in 1998. It's now 21 years later, and now suddenly action is being given to these reforms. This is something that means that although state capture in the last decade had a devastating effect, Eskom should have been on this path a long time ago, and it was an ANC government that sat on its hands for 20 years and is now suddenly waking up when the whole country has been driven into a crisis. However, pointing blame into the past is not going to keep the lights on in the future. So we're of the opinion that with state capture, the perpetrator should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That's why we, along with Sakeliga, announced an intention to launch an article of Section 65 of the Companies Act action against Eskom to make sure that fraudulent directors and everybody who stole taxpayer money from Eskom, because we need to realize that they stole our money. This is taxpayer money that should have been used for schools and infrastructure. That every single perpetrator here gets prosecuted and pays back the money that they stole from the South African public.
Now, your members and everybody else who is at Eskom, will include here the NUM and NUMSA, whom we had tried to invite. All of you are expected to play a role as stakeholders. Let's just take a listen to what the minister had to say about the role that he believes you two would have to play.
The competition between different federations is healthy in a democracy, so let them compete. I think the key issue for us is whether you're competitors or not, we want to work with all of you. Whatever your background, whichever federation you belong to, if you have an interest in Eskom and you have an interest in the electricity industry, then you're an important stakeholder as far as we're concerned, and we want to engage with you, get your ideas. We'll amend things that need to be amended if need be, but let's talk and let's work in a constructive spirit.
Let's talk in a constructive spirit. That's what the minister says or expects of you. What will you be saying to him when you enter into those discussions?
Well, we hope that he does the same. At Solidarity, we're committed to making Eskom work and making South Africa work, for the simple reason if Eskom fails, as Minister Gordhan and President Ramaphosa pointed out, then the country fails. And that's why earlier in the year, when it came to light that there's a dire skills shortage, we facilitated an online petition to get the names of skilled engineers or other technical people who were at Eskom and who are willing to come back and to help keep the lights on. Unfortunately, this was met with silence from the department, so we're hoping that they would revisit that list to help every single South African keep the lights on, quite simply. We've always been willing to engage in a spirit of keeping South Africa going. We expect the same from the department. Luckily, we've now seen a roadmap that we experience as largely positive. There are a couple of vague statements that worry us, but we're sure that the pressure to publish was more due to the credit downgrades than being completely finished, and that these should be finalized and much more definitive in the coming months even. Regarding the unbundling, what we are happy about is that the cheap alternative or the short-term alternative of retrenching, as some people would suggest, half of Eskom staff, is one that the Minister has seen as one that's not necessarily the first option. For the simple reason, Eskom has a lot of staff, but we need every single person on hands on deck to ensure that this turnaround gets done completely correctly. This is, as Minister Gordhan pointed out, much more complex than changing a tire. This is basically fixing a wing of an aircraft whilst it's falling. And as a trade union, we'll do everything in our power to facilitate this, because the stakes are extremely high with Eskom. If we can get the unbundling going and get it to a much more agile and redundant space, where South Africa then is in the hands of more than one generation company, and we can finally get this decentralized system that has a smart grid going, that enables our companies to work around the clock without having generators running during load shedding.
Connie Mulder, thank you very much for your time. He is from Solidarity Research Institute, of course an institute of the trade union Solidarity, which is one of the main unions at Eskom.